Hello and welcome to the RAF Museum, our research lecture series. This is the final event we'll have at Cosford now this year because unfortunately we've had to rearrange our December lecture into 2022 due to the speaker's availability. But it will happen. We're also going to have more lectures here in 2022, which I'm sure you'll all be delighted to hear about. And we're going to have lectures at Wolverhampton, the next one of which is next week on a Thursday. But I'm really pleased to be here today in Cosford. I'm the museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal. For those of you who don't know, please do come in. Firstly, very warm welcomes to those of you joining us here in person at the RAF Museum in Cosford, but also online from around the world, a global audience, as always. Delighted for today's speaker, Stephen Moore. And today's lecture is on steps towards the Area Bombing Offensive, the influence of the Butt Report and the Boulogne-Billancourt raid on policy change. I was going to say, Stephen, having looked at your PhD title as well, you favour long titles, I've realised.
Sorry about that.
So Stephen's PhD was on after the Blitz, Luftwaffe operations over the United Kingdom and the development of the defence systems May 1941 to December 1943. And in fact, Stephen gave a great paper last year, which you'll be able to find online on our Crowdcast past events. His research explores the development of strategic bombing, the experience of civilians on the home front under bombing, aircrew training, the air defence of the UK, and the military applications of scientific developments such as the establishment of British radar network. I had to skip some of your interests off as well, Stephen, because they're encompassing, they're broad, which is a delight, because I think you bring that into your research. So I'm looking forward to today's lecture. Before I hand over, I should note he's currently researching a new history of the Battle of Britain, which will draw on different perspectives to present a familiar story in a distinct way. And I hope that's what we're going to hear today. So, Stephen, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name's Dr. Stephen Moore, and I'm a 20th century conflict historian specialising in air power. The history of the strategic bombing offensive against Germany by RAF Bomber Command has been distorted by several misunderstandings, including the shock of the Butt Report in August 1941, demonstrating that the precision bombing campaign was ineffective. The other more popular misunderstanding is that the appointment of Arthur Harris as AOC&C of Bomber Command allowed him to pursue his policy of area bombing. Technology works, excellent. History, of course, rarely cooperates with such convenient myths, and neither of these facts is actually true. This presentation will show how misgivings about the effectiveness of precision or selective bombing had been growing throughout 1941, and that the Area Bombing Directive was issued before Harris joined Bomber Command. The Air Historical Branch narrative on the bombing offensive against Germany describes the time after March 1942 as a period of expansion and experimentation. Like all experimental work, sometimes the results do not match the original hypotheses, and the development of British area bombing doctrine reflects this process and will be demonstrated during this presentation. Before I talk about the Butt Report, however, I will look back at pre-war and early bombing operations to put into context where Bomber Command found themselves in late 1941. The origins of aerial bombardment lie in the proposal during the French Revolution to attack towns from the air using balloons. It was not until the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, however, that cities were deliberately targeted for attack, in that case by naval bombardment. During the 1849 siege of Venice, the Austrian army used fire balloons to hasten the surrender of the city, but the accuracy was so poor that their further use was not considered practical. The first operational use of reconnaissance balloons was during the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. And by the beginning of the 20th century, balloon units were an accepted part of the composition of most European armies. The development of the dirigible airship meant that for the first time, early aeronauts had control of where they went rather than being reliant on a favourable wind direction. And by 1908, the eponymous airships of Count von Zeppelin had become familiar objects, both in the skies and press across Europe. Raids by airships on the United Kingdom were authorised in January 1915, with targets selected including London, Liverpool and Tyneside. Although Zeppelin attacks continued, the use of fixed-wing aircraft subsequently became more prominent, and later air attacks being carried out by Gotha bombers predominantly on London, most notably on the 13th of June 1917, when 162 people were killed and 432 injured. There was public outrage after this raid due to a stray bomb that hit an infant school in Poplar, killing 16 young children and wounding 30. As attacks continued, the government found it necessary to create the first air raid early warning and control network. They also attempted to bomb towns in the west of Germany, but the achievements of this independent force had been greatly exaggerated. It made a negligible impact on the course of the war. On the German side, Zeppelins caused 557 deaths and injured 1,358, with £3 million of destruction in the United Kingdom, while aeroplane attacks added a further 836 dead and 2,000 injured, together with £1.5 million in damage. The First World War established both the decisive importance of air superiority and the difficulty of finding and accurately hitting targets. The interwar period gave opportunities for the advocates of air power to advance their theories. Gualo Due was widely quoted, if rarely read, claiming that future wars would be settled by opposing air forces independent of the rest of the military, bombing enemy cities into ruins, with the one achieving the most destruction forcing the surrender of the other. The side with the most aircraft and bombs would win, regardless of the destruction faced by their own side. In the United States, William Billy Mitchell demonstrated that bombers could destroy battleships, albeit stationary and unmanned. And arguments about the effectiveness of bombers against warships would continue up until the start of the Second World War. He also argued that an army in the field would be a false objective in a future war, and the real objective should be the vital centres, a statement similar to one made by Churchill 15 years earlier. While both of these figures promoted the use of strategic bombing, they were detached from the military establishments of their countries. In contrast, in the United Kingdom, Hugh Trenchard served as Chief of Air Staff for 10 years. During that time, he preserved the post-war RAF by promoting air control as a cheap alternative to troops for dealing with colonial insurgents. This was promoted as a strategic bombing doctrine for the RAF in publications during the 1930s. It has been argued, however, that RAF thinking about strategic bombing between the wars was not a doctrine, and Trenchhardian bomber purists were a tiny minority in the service. The perceived efficacy of the bomber reached a new level after a speech by Stanley Baldwin in the House of Commons in 1932, when he insisted that the bomber would always get through. This self-evident statement, even in the 21st century, no defence system is 100% effective, was reinforced again by the writings of H.G. Wells in The Shape of Things to Come. This graphically described a world war through the 1940s which laid waste to the majority of the planet and reinforced the apocalyptical potential of aerial bombing. Alexander Korda's film adaptation, Things to Come, took this fixation further, depicting invulnerable fleets of bombers wreaking havoc at will. As war approached, the British government revised their calculations of the impact enemy bombing would have on the United Kingdom. The Air Staff estimated in April 1939 that a daily average of 700 tons of bombs dropped by 650 German aircraft would be the maximum effort possible during the first fortnight of the war. Victims of these mass attacks would have to be secretly buried using cardboard coffins in local lime pits. Each ton of high explosive was expected to cause 50 casualties. This level of casualties was never to be experienced in the United Kingdom, even during the worst periods of the Blitz. Such estimates bore no resemblance to the actual strength and capability of the Luftwaffe at the time and did not take into consideration the availability of serviceable aircraft. At the outbreak of war, Germany had 1,172 twin-engine bombers on strength, with perhaps 20% unserviceable. The commitments of the Luftwaffe in supporting the invasion of Poland meant no aircraft were available for airstrikes further west. As the operations involved would have necessitated long-range attacks across neutral or hostile territory with heavy losses in daylight, the tonnage delivered would have quickly declined and such raids would have been unsustainable. All of these factors ignore the fact that the Luftwaffe system of target selection rejected the idea of attacks against cities for the purposes of terrorizing the population on principle. While the appeal by President Roosevelt to belligerents at the beginning of the war to refrain from bombing civilians in unfortified centres of population was motivated by the prevention of wholesale destruction, it suited both sides to broadly comply with it during the phony war. As the Polish commander of Warsaw declared the city a special military zone, this left it open to bombing as a legitimate military target. The RAF was even less capable of such an offensive, with the head of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, stating in 1937 that his command was entirely unprepared for war, unable to operate except in fair weather. This sense of realism, along with an insistence in forming operational training units at the expense of frontline squadrons, resulted in him being removed from command in April 1940. Because along with Sir Hugh Dowding, he told the air staff the truth rather than what they wanted to hear, and was considered a difficult character. A comprehensive set of Western air plans had been drawn up for attacks on Germany during the build-up towards war. At the outbreak of war, only WA-14 for leaflet raids on Germany was authorised. This at least gave RAF crews experience in operating at night over enemy territory, but were no help in precise navigation or accurate location of targets. The only daylight offensive operations were confined to the bombing of German warships, but these were abandoned after a disastrous attack on Wilhelmshaven in December 1939. Of the 22 Wellington bombers involved in this Battle of the Helgoland Bight, only 10 returned to their bases. The onset of winter persuaded both sides to refrain from an escalation of bombing, and nothing significant occurred until the German campaign against France and the Low Countries began in May 1940. Early in the offensive, the Wehrmacht was halted in southern Rotterdam by Dutch forces defending bridges over the Maas River. Faced with an ultimatum to surrender or face catastrophic bombing, the defenders were still negotiating when Luftwaffe aircraft started bombing the city. German claims that this was a mistake are unconvincing. Kesselring mentions this in his memoirs, as these claims were only made once the war was over. Noble Frankland, later to write the official history of the Bomber Command offensive with Sir Charles Webster, equated the bombing of Rotterdam with that of Warsaw, as both attacks were within battle zones and their object was to bring about the surrender of the military garrisons. Nevertheless, the exaggerated casualty figures from this bombing prompted a reversal of British policy, and Churchill authorised attacks on German targets. It would have been unreasonable not to expect German retaliation, especially since the occupation of the Netherlands offered a shorter journey without having to cross hostile territory, and a directive authorising raids over the United Kingdom was signed on the 24th of May 1940. The subsequent operations that formed the Battle of Britain and the Night Blitz fall outside the scope of this presentation, but the 14 months of bombing, despite widespread damage and heavy casualties, did not break British morale or significantly disrupt the war effort. Since the beginning of raids against German targets in May 1940, RAF Bomber Command had continued operations whenever weather conditions had been favourable and aircraft available. In common with Luftwaffe attacks, RAF bombing activity was markedly reduced during the winters of 1940 and 1941. The number of aircraft dispatched in December 1940, 1,385, was less than half of the September total, 3,141. In December 1941, roughly half the number of aircraft, 1,411, were used in raids compared to those in September, 2,621. Despite this, a propaganda booklet documenting the progress of British bombing between September 1939 and June 1941 confidently assured readers that Bomber Command will allow no pause, no breathing space. Our offensive will go on, fierce because it is relentless, deadly because it is sure. In a similar vein, the propaganda film Target for Tonight, released in July 1941, depicted RAF crews diligently identifying their target and ensuring that bombing was accurate. Before anyone asks me, I have no idea why the poster for a film about a Wellington bombing raid shows a Bolton Paul Defiant instead. Probably just to annoy me, as I'm not a Defiant fan. Behind the scenes, however, there was serious disquiet amongst the air staff about the policy of precision bombing, more accurately described by Webster and Frankland in their official history of selective bombing, and whether its effect on Germany was worth the serious Bomber Command losses. This slide shows the losses of Bomber Command in attacks on Germany from October 1940, after the campaign against invasion barges ended, up until the end of July 1941. Although only a crude measure of cost-benefit analysis, it shows that Bomber Command were losing more aircraft than its bombs were killing. And this is without considering the cost of aircraft, training, fuel, bombs, and the huge infrastructure required to support bombing operations. In January 1941, Sir Richard Pearse, the AOC&C of Bomber Command, objected to the use of his aircraft against German battlecruisers based in Brest, as his command was not designed for such a purpose. The alternative of precision attacks against key industrial targets, such as the oil plan of January 1941, was based on the assumption that it would be possible to bomb on 9 nights a month with an aiming error of only 300 yards. By April 1941, a revised air staff estimate considered such errors to be nearer 1,000 yards, which could be reduced to 600 in optimum conditions. From this point onwards, the air staff began tentatively searching for larger targets, and Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff, whilst he had been AOC&C of Bomber Command, had advocated attacks on German towns as a profitable strategic policy. As the likelihood of decisive results from a selective bombing policy receded, Lord Trenchard, the first Chief of the Air Staff, and who still had the ear of Sir Charles Portal, submitted a memo which urged an all-out attack on German cities to break the morale of the population. Such attacks should occur every night, he contended, from one end of Greater Germany to the other. Trenchard admitted that it would be a costly adventure and would require an enormous force of aircraft to achieve it. He estimated casualties could be as high as 70% a night, and that a 500% reserve would be required behind the front line. If all this sounds similar to the theories of Douai, his conclusions that production of long-range bombers and the training of crews to fly them would have absolute priority confirmed such suspicions. Although the Chiefs of Staff endorsed Trenchard's analysis that the most vulnerable point in the German nation of war is the morale of a civilian population under air attack, they were unwilling to go as far as Trenchard to exploit it. Air cooperation in the Battle of Atlantic would have to continue. It would be impossible to give unconditional priority to a long-range bomber force, and a strong fighter command and fleet air arm was still going to be necessary. Eventually, the Chiefs of Staff believed that Bomber Command could and should directly attack German morale as its primary role. For some time, however, it would remain a limited force and would struggle to achieve a functional concentration. In the Directorate of Bomber Operations, where, as Webster and Franklin describe it, the idea of selective attack died hard, a new plan for an attack on transport was being composed. Such ideas were not new. Long before the US 8th Air Force, marshalling yards were already popular alternative targets, but an effective attack on German transport would be almost as huge an operation as a direct attack on morale. It would also need a much higher degree of accuracy than required to hit a town. But despite abortive attacks in 1940, the Directorate of Bomber Operations no longer felt such objections could prevent the attacks now planned. By limiting the target area to the Ruhr, it might be possible to sever railway links to the rest of Germany. Any bombs that missed railway lines would fall in populated areas and reduce morale, or those aimed at populated areas might miraculously hit railway lines. The actual purpose of this plan was sound. The Ruhr was successfully isolated from the rest of Germany during the transportation campaign in the winter of 1944, but the number of aircraft needed to achieve that goal demonstrate it would never have been possible in 1941. Churchill was not impressed with what he considered a very bleak and restrictive policy, and believed that a programme should be set each month to be completed as far as possible. The Chiefs of Staff did not agree, arguing the Bomber Command operation should work to a definite strategic aim. All of this prevaricating inevitably ended in a compromise that satisfied no one, with a directive published in July 1941 that authorised attacks on 9 railway targets during moonlight conditions in the Ruhr area. The directive specifically stated, "These objectives are therefore to be considered as suitably located for obtaining incidental effects on the morale of the industrial population," or in other words, bombing the residential areas of factory workers. It's in this context that the publication of the Butt Report in August 1941 needs to be considered. David Ben Susan Butt was an economist working in the Cabinet Secretariat. This secretariat was run by Professor Frederick Lindemann, by now Lord Cherwell, who was Churchill's scientific advisor, and seems to pop up like a bad penny no matter what part of the air war I'm researching. As an experimental physicist, Lindemann had carried out research that confirmed some of Albert Einstein's theories, and in 1915 he developed a mathematical theory for aircraft spin recovery. He then learned to fly so he could perform the practical testing of his work, but he subsequently had a difficult relationship with technology. Lindemann had a bias against radar, which he had not been involved in developing, and he used his influence with Churchill to promote trials with long aerial mines that continued long after their ineffectiveness was evident. He then followed this up with aerial flares to illuminate attacking bombers and promoted the use of experimental turbine light Havocs fitted with Helmholtz searchlights in place of armament, and these continued until the end of 1942. Lindemann, who has been described as brilliant but arrogant, still made a contribution to the Allied victory due to his ability to present data visually to promote a strategy. His flawed judgment about technology discounted the potential of radar before the war began, and he later argued that Germany were incapable of developing a flying bomb. And then after the V1 was operational, that they could not successfully deploy a ballistic missile that would hit London. On Lindemann's initiative, Butt reviewed over 600 target photographs taken during June and July, comparing them to operational summaries and other documentary records. The Butt report presented data that concluded only 1/3 of all aircraft recorded as attacking their targets had bombed within 5 miles of them. Geographic factors greatly influenced the percentage of success. For attacks on French ports, 2/3 of aircraft got to within 5 miles of the target. But over the Ruhr, considered the most vital target, the proportion fell to 1/10. With apologies for the awful pun, as with all statistical analysis, the devil is in the detail. The 635 photographs used had been taken on over 500 different sorties, which Webster and Franklin point out meant that some aircraft had taken more than one picture of the purported target area. Butt himself admitted the analysis was not infallible due to photographic errors caused by aircraft manoeuvres during operations, but he was confident that the broad picture was correct. The senior officers in Bomber Command, however, lined up to criticise the report. As well as comments from Sir Richard Pearce, Air Vice Marshal Robert Saunby, Senior Air Staff Officer of Bomber Command, complained that the weather during June and July had been exceptionally poor, and he could not accept that a sample of 10% of all sorties flown was a reliable means of assessing bombing results for the whole force. He also argued that squadron commanders gave cameras to the crews they had least confidence in, although conversely Arthur Harris later thought the cameras were actually given to the best crews. Despite the objections of Bomber Command, the repercussions of the Butt report were already being felt at a higher level. Lindemann, completely ignoring the inaccuracy of the figures and abandoning any kind of experimental reproducibility, told Churchill that the results were sufficiently striking to emphasise the supreme importance of improving our navigational methods. Scientific methodology dictated a further study with a larger sampling size, more photos, and mitigating operational errors to confirm the findings of the Butt report. But Lindemann was too much of a politician by this stage, and scientific integrity evidently no longer meant anything to him. The Butt report influenced the growing suspicions that Bomber Command was incapable of hitting precision targets at night with the available technology. Although Terrain has described this as marking the end of a chapter in Bomber Command, it should be more correctly thought of as a position paper for the benefit of policymakers. The report pointed to the need for scientific navigation aids, a more scientific approach to navigation, and a revolution in bombing tactics. It would take several months before the new policy would take effect, which would not have happened if the Butt report had come as such a shock to the air staff. Unproductive bombing continued until the unacceptable losses during the night of the 7th, 8th of November, when it was reported to the War Cabinet on the 11th of November that 37 RAF aircraft had been lost due to exceptionally poor weather. The Prime Minister highlighted that instructions had been given several times that attacks should not be pushed too hard during unfavourable weather. In battle, he said, heavy losses must be faced, but it was undesirable to expose our aircraft to extreme hazards in the course of routine operations. Sir Richard Pearce was heavily criticised for these losses, and it was clear it was only going to be a matter of time before he would be replaced. By the 13th of November, these comments had been translated into policy, which remained in force until the spring of 1942. The start of the British area bombing campaign in 1942 has become associated with the appointment of Air Marshal Arthur Harris as AOC and C of Bomber Command. Following the Butt Report, a period of time was spent evaluating future policy. The government was committed to a 4,000 bomber plan, but the lack of accuracy highlighted by the report meant there was a concern this would greatly reduce the efficacy of such a force. Over the winter of 1941, the concept of concentrating aircraft over a city as a nominal target rather than individual objectives was developed, reasoning that the majority of bombs dropped would still hit something instead of ending up in open countryside, something that had been rationalised in the previous Ruhr transport plan. This was then translated into official policy when the Area Bombing Directive was issued on the 14th of February. It was not until 9 days later, on the 23rd of February 1942, that Harris assumed command. The raid on the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt in the suburbs of Paris on the 3rd of March 1942 marked the beginning of the new area bombing policy. This was the largest bombing raid by the RAF up to this date, with 235 aircraft taking part, concentrated over a single target with all aircraft bombing in a 110-minute period. As shown in the image, the target area, if I press the button, was only 3 kilometres from the Eiffel Tower and less than 5 kilometres from the Louvre. The importance of this attack was highlighted in a British publication as early as 1942 and was later reinforced by Harris in the memoirs that he published shortly after the end of the war. The German reaction to the raid can be characterised by the exultant tone of the Goebbels diary area. The bomb raid on Paris is the most sensational of the day. Its extent was far greater than first imagined. It is reported to me that emotions have reached the boiling point in Paris. The critical position of the Boulogne-Billancourt raid has been subsequently strengthened in the historiography, most notably as it employed the mass use of flares for the first time, but this has been reassessed twice since 2012. Firstly, Matt Perry, who taught me when I was doing my master's, demonstrated that attempts by German and Vichy authorities to use the attack to turn public opinion against the British was unsuccessful. It has also been proposed by Richard Overy that the German decision to resume attacks on British cities was prompted by the Boulogne-Billancourt raid, instead of being attributed to the destruction of Lübeck later the same month. Because on the same day that Goebbels made his diary entry, retaliation against British targets was discussed at a conference held by Reich Marshal Göring. It was reported that the Führer wanted the strongest forces available to undertake reprisal raids on London as soon as the weather was suitable. But it wasn't until the 14th of April, over 2 weeks after the Lübeck attack, that a directive for a renewed bombing offensive against British cities was issued. Although Boulogne-Billancourt was classed as a successful operation, Bomber Command had been unable to carry out a full-scale area attack due to the operational restrictions in place, which reflected France's status as a defeated ally rather than a belligerent country. The RAF had finally caught up with the Luftwaffe in the provision of radio navigation blind bombing aids during the winter of 1941, when G, an acronym for GRID, was introduced, that enabled a location fix using 3 ground stations with an accuracy of the order of a few hundred yards at ranges up to 350 miles. One of the major reasons for issuing the Area Bombing Directive was to take advantage of the availability of G to launch more concentrated attacks. The first use of G was against Essen on the 8th-9th of March, but results were disappointing despite 80% of aircraft claiming to have attacked the target. Over the next month, 8 attacks were made against Essen, but without any substantial success achieved. It was soon discovered that G accuracy was severely diminished in the Ruhr area, and that blind bombing operations would not be possible until other radio devices became available. Visibility was limited due to the industrial smog which lingered over the built-up area between Essen and Dortmund, which prevented effective bombing in the absence of accurate target marking. Operations against other targets escalated as shown in the table, and Bomber Command continued their experimental tactics with an attack on Lübeck on the 28th, 29th of March, when the first German city went up in flames. This was a saturation attack using incendiaries on a target with the Altstadt at its centre, shown in the top right of the slide, which was largely of medieval construction so that the buildings were inflammable and the streets narrow and tortuous. Although this is a photograph of the area as reconstructed post-war, the narrow streets are still evident with the obvious risk of fire spreading. Lying outside the range of G, Lübeck was also chosen because it could be easily identified from the air. The raid was considered a complete success, with the majority of the city centre destroyed by fire and the suburbs heavily damaged. The number of bombers taking part in this attack was very similar to Boulogne-Billancourt, reflecting the operational strength of Bomber Command at this time. 1,000 houses were destroyed and 4,000 damaged, while 520 people were killed and 785 injured. The German response was a great deal more measured than after the Boulogne-Billancourt raid. This Sunday has been thoroughly spoilt by an exceptionally heavy air raid by the RAF on Lübeck, Goebbels noted in his diary the day after the raid. After speaking to the Gaultier of the affected area, he reported, "He believes that no German city has ever before been so severely attacked from the air. Conditions in part of Lübeck are chaotic." As I said earlier, the Lübeck attack has been consistently cited by historians since the 1950s as the reason Hitler authorised the Baedeker raids, and that wasn't challenged and disproved until 2012. And just when you think you're safe, the bad penny turns up again. The day after the Lübeck attack, Frederick Lindemann presented a paper on the possibilities of dehousing civilians using area bombing, which was another example of his ability to present data visually to promote a strategy. An accurate method of calculating the effects of bombing was not available, so Lindemann proposed a way of estimating damage and provided the final rationalisation for the programme. Lindemann highlighted that the effects of raids on Birmingham, Hull and elsewhere have shown that on average 1 ton of bombs dropped on a built-up area demolishes 20 to 40 dwellings and turns 100 to 200 people out of house and home. Drawing on the civilian experience during the Blitz, he concluded, "Investigation seems to show that having one's house demolished is most damaging to morale. People seem to mind it more than having their friends or even relatives killed." Nothing in what Lindemann recommended was new. His summary relied on information known for some time. But it should be noted that the data for his report was provided by Solly Zuckerman, who had already concluded that the German bombing of the United Kingdom had not broken the will of the people and had so informed Lindemann, who chose to ignore this evidence in his report. As Churchill held the opinions of Lindemann in high esteem, his minute was important in averting a major crisis over the employment of Bomber Command during 1942-43. The Area Bombing Directive, in conjunction with the dehousing memorandum, would prescribe British bombing policy for the next 2 years. Although the use of repeated attacks against the same objective had been previously explored by Bomber Command, these were unsuccessful until a sequence of 4 raids on Rostock between the 23rd and the 26th of April. None of these raids was particularly heavy, the maximum number of aircraft operating in one night being 163, with some aircraft specifically assigned to bomb the Heinkel aircraft factory close to the town. Over the 4 nights, a relatively modest 523 aircraft were dispatched to Rostock, with the results achieved in stark contrast to the sequence of attacks on Essen for the loss of only 8 aircraft. 60% of the main town area was destroyed, along with 1,765 buildings, while another 513 were seriously damaged. Casualties were significantly reduced by the large numbers of people who left the town after the first raids, but overall there were still 204 people killed and another 80 injured. As Somber Goebbels reported, the British are publicising the last air raid on Rostock in the grand manner. It has been, it must be admitted, pretty disastrous. Reluctantly conceding, community life there is practically at an end. Following these raids, the Germans started to use the term terror raid, for the first time. Although the British 1,000 bomber raids were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, their undertaking at this stage of the war was a significant achievement and were a genuine attempt by Bomber Command to concentrate a large force against a single target. Analysis of the reasons behind these raids reveals that such embellishment was as much for British as well as German consumption. Although the science of navigation was still not perfect, the official history notes Bomber Command had been able to achieve concentrated bombing on several occasions from March 1942 onwards, as I've previously described. This comment is significant because Noble Franklin served as a navigator in Bomber Command, as shown in this photograph of him with his crew in front of the Lancaster. As well as being a historian, Franklin's professional assessment of Bomber Command's performance during this period, based on his own experience during a tour of operations, is worthy of consideration. Air Marshal Harris was aware of a chorus of criticism against area bombing, so during May he planned an attack to address public comments and stamp his authority on his new command, winning approval to send 1,000 bombers against a single German city. At this time, an attack by 250 aircraft was regarded as a strong bomber force in itself, but one of his bomber groups would contribute that number of aircraft alone. Assembling the force for Operation Millennium required very nearly the absolute maximum of British bomber strength, but utilising the entire first-line strength of Bomber Command still left a considerable gap between Harris's intention and reality. This was filled by aircraft from the bomber operational training groups, so that 367 aircraft for this raid were operated by either instructor or trainee crews. This force was twice the size of any ever sent by the Luftwaffe against the United Kingdom, and to achieve this was no mean task in 1942. Harris was aware of the risk of committing his total frontline strength and all his reserves to a single operation, and the potential consequences to the future training and expansion of Bomber Command. The initial target was Hamburg, with routes to the target prepared by the 23rd of May, detailing the German defences. As the weather deteriorated during the following week, Cologne was confirmed as an alternative target. All aircraft involved were moved to their allocated station by the 26th of May, requiring many of the OTU aircraft to relocate from their usual bases to other airfields, which caused disruption to Bomber Command's training programme. The 1,047 aircraft were concentrated over Cologne in a stream, so that the raid was completed in 90 minutes. Damage was heavy. 3,300 buildings were destroyed and 7,908 damaged, with 59,000 people made homeless, in addition to the 486 killed and 5,000 injured. Despite the destruction, however, the city had been by no means wiped out, as Harris had intended. Planning to take advantage of the full moon, the assembled force stood by to deliver a second attack, but the weather was unsuitable. On the following night, the forecast was less than ideal, but the disruption to training could not be tolerated much longer, so 956 aircraft, including 347 from OTUs, were sent to Essen. Once again, the city proved elusive, with damage being light and no concentration achieved on the sprawling Krupp's armament works. There was heavy cloud over Essen on this night, in addition to the usual industrial haze, so that the weather gave almost complete protection to the city. Such difficulties would not be resolved until August 1942, when Harris finally withdrew his opposition to the establishment of a Pathfinder marking force, which allowed the effective concentration of area bombing. The dispatch of 2,000 aircraft in 3 nights was, however, a significant demonstration of the growing strength of British bombing. Harris then considered making 1,000 bomber raids a permanent feature of the bombing offensive. He estimated that 2 to 4 consecutive 1,000 bomber raids on a city the size of Cologne would have the effect of virtually destroying the objective to the extent of putting it out of action for any foreseeable duration of the war. He also thought that losses would be reduced, as German night fighters could only bag their quota within limits, whatever the size of force employed, so a larger bomber force would reduce the percentage of casualties. Only one more raid of this size was attempted in 1942, when 1,006 aircraft, of which 960 were from Bomber Command, attacked Bremen on the 25th-26th of June. 2/3 of the force claimed to have hit the target, but since only 572 buildings were destroyed and 85 people killed, this implies that many bombs missed the city. Despite reducing the bombing period to 65 minutes, the losses were the heaviest of the 3 raids, and also included 22 aircraft from OTUs, over 40% of the losses, all but one manned by trainee crews. John Terrain argued that the 1,000 bomber raids put Bomber Command back on the map, with both the public and the government, but Harris soon found himself having to argue why further operations were impracticable after originally advocating them. Harris explained that Bomber Command had only 30 operational squadrons plus the OTUs that supplied them. The number of sorties possible was therefore limited by the number of casualties that could be sustained, and he estimated this was between 4,000 and 5,000 sorties per month. The 1,000 raids had attempted to overwhelm the defences by using a concentrated bomber stream, but 123 bombers did not return over the 3 raids, which were the highest losses of the war up to this time. Bomber Command would not dispatch over 1,000 aircraft to a single target again until 1944, which by then would be under very different circumstances. Harris still intended using his OTUs against nearer or more easily identified targets, but during the next 3 months it was only possible to dispatch a force exceeding 500 aircraft on one occasion. The use of OTUs was discontinued due to bad weather, rising losses, and the evident damage that was being done to the training programme. Richard Overy has suggested that some OTUs were close to mutiny at the loss of instructors and the demands made of trainees flying obsolescent aircraft to make up the numbers for the 1,000 bomber raids. Despite the ruthless and single-minded nature of Harris's personality, once it became clear that the 1,000 bomber raids were threatening the sustainability of his command, he quietly discontinued the policy, something that his Luftwaffe counterpart proved incapable of doing. Subsequent raids therefore concentrated on effectiveness rather than sheer numbers, and the number of aircraft dispatched increased naturally as Bomber Command continued to expand. So, in conclusion, it is only by using a longer perspective that the significance of the Butt report in the development of area attacks within Bomber Command can be understood. The Butt report did not reveal unexpected information about bombing accuracy, but was actually a logical progression towards the realisation that precision or selective bombing was beyond the capabilities of Bomber Command in 1941. The statistical analysis can generously be described as massaged, and the presence of Lindemann orchestrating a favourable outcome to the area bombing discussions is undeniable. Despite the Butt report, it took 7 months before the Boulogne-Billancourt raid demonstrated the possibilities of area attack. This was reinforced by the outrageously incorrect conclusions drawn in Lindemann's dehousing memorandum, which in my opinion, having worked in science for 25 years, proved he had ceased to be a scientist by this time and was instead pursuing a political agenda. The disappointment of G not providing a reliable target finding system led to the area raids on Lübeck and Rostock and provided a way for Arthur Harris to attempt his ambitious 1,000 bomber raids. All of these attacks demonstrated that if a concentration of bombing could be achieved, this could cause an overwhelming amount of damage. The variable results of the 1,000 bomber raids clearly demonstrated that reliable bombing results would only be possible if consistently accurate target marking was possible, and the introduction of the Pathfinder force, despite Harris's reservations, would take the Bomber Command offensive to the next level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm going to give you a moment to gather yourself before we launch into the questions. For those of you here and watching online, we have a lecture in Wolverhampton, which is being live streamed. That's next week at Thursday from the university at 5:15. And the following week will be digital only when David Spruce, who is a Wolverhampton PhD student, will be talking about the Royal Flying Corps and their training. And he's going to counter the myth that they suffered extortionate losses in that process. So, as I enjoyed the lecture, I think you touched on this in your conclusion as you were driving through, but how far did Bomber Command and its approach to bombing depend on the technological developments which accompanied the bombing war? You know, how much was it essential to have?
I think it was enormously essential. You don't really see anything happen significantly until you get into 1943, when you've got G being used widespread amongst the main force, and you've got the H2S radar coming in as well. And by that time, of course, the Pathfinder force is properly established, not just as a Pathfinder force, but it's also an extra group in Bomber Command. And that improves the results enormously, which you start seeing from, well, look at the Hamburg attack in the middle of 1943.
So we're going to take questions in the room, also online. Yes, sir. I'm going to start with one of the ones which came online, which was they asked if you could elaborate on the Baedeker raids.
Baedeker raids, it's actually the 80th anniversary of the Baedeker raids this year, because it started in April 1942. So following on from Boulogne-Billancourt, Hitler threw his rattle out of his pram and decided he wanted the Luftwaffe to start bombing British targets again. Unfortunately, the majority of the bomber force was on the Eastern Front, so it took 6 to 8 weeks to transfer the necessary aircraft back, also get some target marking people back as well, before they wanted to start bombing again. Hitler was insistent that they were going to bomb London, but the Luftwaffe planners knew that if they did that, they'd be wiped out. So they had to go for targets which didn't actually have ground defences. So that's why you see them bomb Exeter, because Exeter didn't have any anti-aircraft guns. To be honest, the British didn't even realise that the bomber campaign had begun, because the first 2 nights, the majority of the bombs missed Exeter. It was only the night after, when they went to bomb Bath, that they actually achieved a concentration, and that's when the attack started. But the Germans were just doing what they'd done in the autumn of 1941. They were bombing targets either on the coast or very close to the coast, so that cut down the time that British night fighters could actually intercept them, and were also trying to attack as quickly as possible to reduce losses. Is that enough, I think?
I have a question and a comment. First, a question. I've heard it argued that if production of the 4-engined bombers had been stopped and that production capacity switched to Mosquitoes, the Bomber Command offensive would have been more effective. How do you respond to that concept?
I've heard this from a few peer people, but it's a bit of a counterfactual because it never actually took place. But I would imagine the amount of extra pilots that would had to train in order to do that would have caused the training program severe problems. So I don't think it was realistic. I think they could have possibly increased the percentage of Mosquitoes that were used, but I don't think you could have replaced the whole of the 4-engine bomber force with Mosquitoes.
Yeah, I think you would have needed a ratio of something like 4 or 5 to 1, but you wouldn't have needed wireless operators, air gunners, but of course a lot more pilots and navigators.
Yes.
Okay. My comment is that I think that Bomber Command was envisaged as a rapier, but with certain exceptions, even at the end of the war, was still a club.
Yes, absolutely,
but
I agree.
one useful side effect of the air offensive was the destruction of landlines, which forced military traffic onto wireless, which meant that the guys at Bletchley Park could interpret it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good comment, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. Here.
Yeah, John Hale here. Harris was notoriously anti-panacea targets.
Yes.
But in view of the limited effectiveness in 41, early 42, might it not have been wiser to transfer a couple of Halifax and Wellington squadrons to coastal because of the ravages of the Battle of the Atlantic?
Absolutely. The lack of long-range aircraft in Coastal Command was causing a lot of problems at the time. I completely agree that some of the aircraft should have been transferred to Coastal Command, but with Harris in charge, that was never going to happen. And it's interesting you're talking about panacea targets as well, because after the destruction in Hamburg, Harris saw the potential of being able to do that to Berlin. So he started the Battle of Berlin, which almost destroyed Bomber Command, and you could argue that the Battle of Berlin was the biggest panacea target of all, and it was his panacea target, nobody else's.
Okay, Stephen, I've got a question online here, which which is from Jonathan Kempster, who asks, how were secure radio communications maintained during operations?
Well, there was no radio telephony. It was all done by wireless telegraphy, Morse code, and the bomber forces used code names rather than real squadron names or whatever. The targets were all called by. It was he was a fisherman, wasn't he? Was it, the senior air staff officer? They didn't really give away any information. It was all covert, the communications. The only time they'd use RT was really when they were landing after a raid.
I think it's quite interesting. The use of RT, particularly in the warm-up raids, and same with WT traffic, was used by the German Y service as an indication of the strength of the raid.
Yes, when they were doing their air test on the day before, yes, they would estimate how many aircraft were going to be involved, yes.
Okay, do we have a question in the room? I'm going to bring it up to you in a moment. So the question here is from James Knightley. He says, do you have any thoughts or information about why British pre-war assessments of German bombing capability were so completely detached from reality?
Yeah. Well, firstly, James, thanks for getting up in the middle of the night in Australia to actually watch. And everybody had unrealistic aspirations of what bombing was going to do. They'd seen the destruction that had taken place primarily in London in the First World War, and had basically projected that so high up that they were thinking that all raids were going to be catastrophic. I imagine most people in the room have actually seen Corder's Shape of Things to Come film. When the war actually starts and any town, which is obviously London, gets absolutely flattened, and people honestly believed that bombing was going to be that effective. But there hadn't been enough scientific or technical work to actually establish what the level of destruction would be. People just projected, based on what happened on the First World War, that it was going to be X factors greater than it had been in 1914, 1918.
I was curious in your comment, in your presentation about Lindemann himself, and you referred to the fact that he didn't become a scientist at the end of the day, so clearly there were other factors in play. In your opinion, what were they?
Well, Lindemann had a very, very cosy relationship with Churchill, and he exploited that relationship to drive the British war effort the way that he thought it should go. Solly Zuckerman in his book says some very interesting things about Lindemann, and R.V. Jones in Most Secret War has a lot of interesting things to say about Lindemann as well, especially around the very bitter discussions that he had with them when he presented the photographs taken at Peenemünde of the V2 rockets, and Lindemann was adamant that they weren't real.
Am I right? Was it Lindemann who refused to believe Jones when he talked about the beams bouncing off the stratosphere?
Yes, that was an early one as well. Yeah, but that's, I left that bit out, but yes, he didn't believe that the Germans were using radio beams to do blind bombing either, until it was proved to him.
Yeah, Jones really goes for him in his book.
Oh yes, he does. Yeah, they clearly didn't like each other at all, and I get the impression that Zuckerman had no time for him as well.
Okay, do we have a question in the room at all? Okay, so online we've been asked. Oh, I'll come up in a second. I'll bring it to you. We've been asked, did Bomber Command ever reach the 4,000 bombers which were planned and effectively be able to use them in operations?
No, they never got to 4,000 bombers. It was unrealistic. When the British did the reset in 1943, when they realised that they were actually running out of people to go into the armed forces and also to keep production going, because by this time they'd already surpassed the amount of people that had been called up in the First World War, it was decided that things were going to have to be trimmed down. So the Navy lost X number of ships, the Army lost X number of divisions, and the RAF lost X number of squadrons. They never got to the 4,000 plan.
Yeah. Just a quickie. Was the Spanish War, the effects of the Spanish
exercise that went on, were they taken into account at any time in the estimates?
You mean during the Spanish Civil War?
The result of the Spanish Civil War, yeah.
The one that everyone remembers is the big attack by the Italian Air Force on Barcelona, which killed a couple of thousand people, but that was because it was a complete surprise attack. There was no air raid shelters and there was no early warning system. And people actually equated that with what H.G. Wells and Corder did with the book and the film, and this reinforced the hysteria, really, that took place when people thought that bombing was going to be apocalyptical. There's lots of footage of people digging slit trenches in London parks in September 1938, around the Munich crisis, honestly expecting that within a couple of weeks, bombers were going to be coming over and attacking London.
So we've got a question about the Pathfinder Force and how important it was. Well, it's actually saying, thank you for mentioning it, but I think leading on from that, how important was the Pathfinder Force in driving Bomber Command's ability to concentrate on targets?
Someone's just said essential. The bombing would have been as variable as the 3,000 bomber raids were if they hadn't actually established the Pathfinder Force. And it wasn't just the Pathfinders coming in, it was the new technology coming in as well. And although lots of people have criticised the Dam Busters raid as a diversion from the main effort, the one thing that emerged from the Dam Busters raid was the use of a master bomber. And that became pretty much standard throughout the later part of the war. So if target indicators went down and they were in the wrong place, so don't bomb on the greens, bomb on the reds, because the master bomber would tell them where they were going to, where they had to bomb. So a combination of Pathfinders, better technology, more powerful bombs, all contributed to making Bomber Command operations more effective. But yes, the Pathfinders were essential.
Yeah, to be a little controversial, Fighter Command wasn't doing very much good work in 41, 42. Was there really no thought about the night fighter squadrons actually giving support to Bomber Command by interdicting Luftwaffe night fighter airfields? So it didn't seem to happen very much from what I've read.
Well, there's a couple of intruder squadrons that used to do that every night. They'd go out and they'd actually bomb German airfields in France. But they didn't specifically target the night fighter airfields. It was just airfields where German aircraft were operating. But the rest of the night fighter force actually was extremely short of aircraft and crews right the way through to the beginning of 1942. And then throughout 1942, the aircraft situation was fine, but normally with a day fighter squadron, you used to have 16 aircraft and maybe 22, 23 pilots in the squadron. But I did this for my PhD. I looked at all of the personnel for the night fighter squadrons, and at no time up until the end of 1942 did any fighter squadron have more trained aircrew than the aircraft that they had. It is really, yeah.
It always seems strange to me that the Dams raid was a very self-contained operation. And I've always wondered why, every now and again, a crew wasn't briefed to fly over the repair works and drop a cookie on it.
Completely agree. I have no idea why they didn't follow up, because they didn't need the same level of accuracy. Even if you missed the actual repair work, you would actually hit the workers' accommodation, so you would disrupt it that way. I have absolutely no idea why they didn't do that. It just seemed like a really strange thing to do.
Okay, do we have a question in the room? I shall come up to you, sir. I like this question. It's one which I wouldn't have thought to ask myself, which is around the Luftwaffe's bombing of neutral Dublin, and whether or not, we've talked about Jones and the jamming, whether or not beam jamming may have impacted on this. But I think just broadening that into just the wider inaccuracies of bombings from both sides, I mean, bombs are dropped on Ireland by both the RAF and Boulogne-Billancourt.
Yes, they were, yes.
The need to paint giant IR signs into the countryside, because even in daytime this was an issue.
Yeah.
How important is this, particularly on that jamming question, perhaps?
I haven't really looked at the bombing of Dublin, to be perfectly honest, but I think that was pretty much at the limit of the German blind bombing aids. And once you get to that distance, a couple of degrees difference in the direction doesn't take much for you to actually end up hitting Dublin instead of hitting Belfast.
It's just I'd just be interested in your opinion. In conversation with fellow devotees of Bombing Command, we're discussing the tactics and decision made by the likes of Churchill, Hornby, Harris, Portal and others. And I often remark upon the fact that a lot of these senior officers in the Second World War had served in the trenches in the First World War. In your opinion, how do you think that experience affected their strategic thinking in the Second, if at all?
Well, I think Harris was originally a cavalryman, wasn't he, before he actually
Yeah, I think he was a bugler in the Rhodesian
regiment.
regiment.
I think he was, yeah. And I think Portal was an infantry officer before he became an airman. And for both of them, they wanted to achieve results using the air so that people wouldn't have to go in and fight the same way as they had in the First World War. Of course, the ground war was completely different because it didn't stagnate in the way that it did in the First World War. But I think their honest intentions were to try to prevent having to carry out a large-scale invasion of Europe. Because as late as April 1944, Harris is arguing that the strategic bombing offensive will mean that they don't have to have an invasion, when clearly overload is going to happen at that point. But yes, I think that because of their experiences during the First World War, they were desperate to avoid a large-scale invasion and the kind of casualties that took place on the Western Front.
Okay, do we have a question in the room? No, we'll wave if you want to attract my attention. This question comes from Alex Halls, and he says that the Air Ministry reports in the Millennium Raids revealed that Harris admitted the raid on Bremen was particularly disappointing militarily owing to cloud cover, but he was very pleased by the reception to the raid amongst the British public. And Alex has asked, do you think that part of the reason why Harris wished to continue large-scale raids was also driven by their propaganda value that they offered, as well as their military value, especially as he wished to improve the reputation of the command following the Butt report?
Yes, as I said in the presentation, I think that the 1,000 bomber raids were as much for British consumption as they were for German consumption, to affect propaganda and morale on both sides.
I'm just going to give the online audience here in the room as well a chance to reflect, ask any more questions for a moment. I want to ask you to pick up on that First World War point. I think we often recognise that strategic bombing, particularly in British grand strategy, was driven by a wish to avoid the casualties of the trenches, both during the interwar period and well into the Second World War. But in terms of the commander's abilities to not be overly concerned, as I think you will inevitably have to avoid this question if you're in command, about your own losses, the losses you're inflicting in Germany, that ability to recognise that casualties are an inevitable aspect on a huge scale. How much is that driven by the First World War, do you feel, their experiences of mass casualties during that war?
You look at the casualty levels in bomber commands and you look at the number of aircrew that took part, and pretty much 50% of them became casualties. But then I think that the people in command looked at those figures and equated those to the casualties on the Western Front and saw, from their point of view, the casualties that were taking part in the bombing war were actually trivial compared to what the casualties were like in the First World War. But I also think that they didn't look at it in the correct way. When you consider the amounts of training and expense and technology involved in the bombing war, I think the casualties were probably, you need to put a factor in there to inflate the casualties to actually be able to compare like with like. Because I think they were comparing two different things. I think they honestly thought that they were doing it from the right point of view, but I don't think they were critical enough about the casualties that were taking place.
I think it's a really interesting point around the ability to include the economic factors in training and the aircraft, the material, as well as the men. I think it's a really important point to reflect on. Got time for one more question? If you want to, yes, good. Okay.
What have you got for me this time, John?
I recall reading somewhere that Bomber Command took up about 15% of the British GDP. Was that figure correct?
I haven't heard that figure, but to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me when you consider how complicated a piece of technology a heavy bomber was, and also the enormous amount of money it took to actually train the crew if you compared it to how much it would cost to train soldiers. So that wouldn't, I haven't heard that figure, but that would not surprise me.
I think there's a thesis which was written in Australia by a doctoral student who looked at the economic cost of developing the strategic bombing offensive, and that sounds the sort of figure that they produced, but their methodology has been criticised. So I wouldn't wish to comment. I can just tell you that if you Google it, you'll find it. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, I think we're out of questions, which is a great place to be. You've answered everything, Stephen, on the entire topic. Well done. I really enjoyed the lecture, as I said. Very, very many thanks for coming and speaking to us in Cosford. So everyone here, if you can thank Stephen for his lecture. Okay. I'm going to thank you all for having been here. We will be back in 2022. You're all welcome to join us at Wolverhampton University, if only because we're going to the pub after the talk. So more than welcome to come and join us. And the online